Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's primer on compliance and enforcement issues for plastics pollution. My name is Susanna Dibble, and I'm a public interest environmental law fellow here at ELI. We have an amazing group of speakers today. As you all are well aware, it's a busy time for addressing plastics pollution, with the UN making it a priority for its 73rd General Assembly to the upcoming 4th session of negotiations for a new plastics treaty. Thank you to Lee, Margaret, Alexandra, Chocho, and Joe for joining us to break down and discuss such a timely topic. I also want to thank all of you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Now, following their opening presentations today, we will have a roundtable discussion and be taking some audience questions later in the program. Please don't wait to submit any questions you have. You can use Zoom's Q&A function at any time throughout the webinar, and our moderator and speakers will be able to see it. We encourage you to use the chat for any observations or comments, but we will be pulling discussion questions from the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom's interface, not the chat. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the event webpage to view later. So if you can't stay for the whole webinar today, the recording will be available within a few business days at eli.org. Before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful moderator, Lee Paddock. Lee is a visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute, where he is managing director of the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. He is also a distinguished professorial lecturer of environmental law at the George Washington University Law School. Lee previously served as Associate Dean for Environmental Law Studies at the George Washington University Law School from 2007 to 2019, and was Director of Environmental Legal Studies at Peace University's House School of Law from 2002 to 2007. From 1978 until 1999, Lee was an Assistant Attorney General with the Minnesota Attorney General's Office, where he served as Director of Environmental Policy for 13 years. Lee, thank you for moderating today's discussion, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome everyone. Obviously, from the number of folks interested in the topic, this is an issue on a lot of people's minds. I want to just introduce INES briefly. INES is the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. We've been around since the late 1980s, co-founded by US EPA and the Dutch government. We're a network of networks, so we have networks in all regions of the world, in Africa and Asia, in South Pacific, in the United States, and in Europe. The plastics issue has become, as all of you know, more and more prominent as a critical environmental issue, in part because of the scale of plastics use. There are about 450 million tons of plastics produced each year. About 2/3 of those are short-lived plastics. About half of the plastic ends up in landfills. Not quite a quarter is mismanaged in some way. It's either becomes litter or illegal disposal. And there are increasing efforts to regulate plastics, which raises significant compliance issues. So a number of single-use bans emerging. New extended producer responsibility laws, certainly in the EU, but in the US, in Maine, Oregon, and California, EPR has become part of the regulatory regime for plastics. Certainly lots of pollution standards associated with the manufacturing of plastics, continuing illegal transport and disposal issues, which also raise important criminal enforcement questions. And now with the INC negotiations, really important questions of what kinds of compliance and enforcement mechanisms should be being designed into the treaty structure, including capacity building and other means of supporting effective implementation. So lots of questions that we hope to address today. And we're going to start with a little bit of the science around plastics pollution. And we're really privileged to have one of the leading scientists in the world on this issue with us today, Margaret Spring, who's the Chief Conservation and Science Officer for the Monterey Bay Aquarium, will be our first speaker. From 2009 to 2013, she held leadership roles at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, first as Chief of Staff and then as Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Oceans and Atmosphere. Prior to her tenure in the Obama administration, Margaret led the Nature Conservancy's California Coastal and Marine Program. And from 1999 to 2007, she served on Capitol Hill as a senior counsel and then general counsel for the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Margaret, thank you for joining us. And I turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you all for being here today. I am a bit of a scene setter. I'm actually not a scientist. I advocate for science. I'm a lawyer, like many of you, and started my career in hazardous waste law as in private practice. So this is a very interesting topic for me as well as for you, and the science here is very clear. There's more to be done. But I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what we know just to remind people, and then we'll turn it over to our next speaker. So let's see. Okay, so many of you know that plastic is being produced at an unmanageable pace. Global plastic production has increased 230-fold since 1950. You see the dotted line. It is not looking like it's going to abate. And every year we have even higher estimates of production. Now that represents different kinds of production, but this is a pace that is not going to work, especially as Lee said, very little of it is recycled at this moment. And so the leakage, what we're talking about when we talk about leakage, is that about 12 million tons of plastic make their way into the ocean every year. And that's just the ocean. And you've seen other science recently about it's airborne, it's in your food, all protein sources. So it's definitely everywhere we look. Plastic pollution clearly is an ocean problem. This captured the public's attention. Of course, there's heartbreaking photos of animals entangled, starving. It's found in most marine habitats on Earth, from the deepest sea to the top of a mountain, to the top of the ocean, and in the midwater. It's everywhere. If you look behind me, the Monterey Bay, we found it in microplastics all through the water column, particularly in the midwater, which was surprising to us. And then, of course, microplastic and associated chemicals travel through the marine food web, implicating human health. But as I said, it's not just the marine food web at this point. It's ubiquitous and it's persistent. So plastic pollution is clearly not only an ocean problem, it's a people problem. It disproportionately impacts vulnerable people and communities at all stages of the plastic products life cycle. And that's an important thing to remember as I move through this, because more and more information is coming about every stage of that life cycle. Certainly, this is more vulnerable communities and poorer communities around the world, and also countries that actually receive exports of waste, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But also there are vulnerable types of people, particularly women and children, and I'll get into that later. But in general, this is a social and environmental equity issue, and you've seen that that's discussed not only here in California, but all the way to the US and to the global discussion. And just to put a finer point on it in terms of how big this problem is, most plastic is from fossil sources, which means oil and gas, essentially. It's 98.9% of plastics today are still made with fossil sources. So all of the impacts that come from extraction, transportation, and co-locating facilities in poor communities, these are all the same issues that are happening with plastic and implicated in the way plastics are made and how they are derived. So not only do we have an environmental issue and societal issue, but we have health. This has come to the fore. Climate, as we divert oil and gas and fossil sources away from transportation, a big growth area is in making more and more plastic from fossil sources. So that means that we are seeing, and there are projections that there will be increases to greenhouse gas emissions, just as we are trying to meet our other obligations under the Paris Agreement and other statutes. So, and then finally, the economy. This is very costly. The generators of this product are not suffering the consequences of the product. And that means the polluter pays. If all lawyers know, particularly here in the United States, that the polluter pays principle is a critical principle. Prevention is a big principle here, but most of the costs are borne in by communities in cleaning up, also health costs. I'll get into that. So there are very many dimensions to this problem. It's, and probably 5 or 10 years ago, we all thought it was an ocean waste problem. Well, we're talking about something very different now. So whose problem is it? It is everyone's, and it's not just a waste management issue, as I suggested, and that has been how we have traditionally approached it, and we haven't done well on waste management over time, and particularly in some countries don't have what we have here in the United States, even though even in the United States we're not doing as well as we would like to. And so the source reduction is really an issue, and this is where the science is pointing us. And this has to do with not only production, but the export and the movement globally. And so this is going to be implicated, of course, in today's discussion. One thing I'm going to walk you through a couple of reports. These are not all the reports that have been issued, but these are influential reports. And this report came out in 2021, which is a report by the UN Environment Program and ASUL, which is a California-based NGO and focused on environmental justice in the ocean areas. And so it's really the global scale issue started to really ramp up on human health and equity and human rights. Impacted communities are very actively speaking about this issue. They're at the treaty, and we'll talk about that. And of course, what has happened is that's brought the spotlight into toxic chemicals and plastic products, which is what you're going to see unfold here. So at that same time, around that same time, well, actually I was the chair of the National Academy study called for by Congress on the US role in global ocean plastic waste. We started that in 2021. And at the end of 2021, we were just about to complete that report when this report came out. And it was a very comprehensive synthesis globally of what the situation is with plastic pollution. And I was relieved as chair to find that their findings were very similar to ours. Unfortunately, that the emissions are projected to increase. The release of chemicals, they brought that to the fore for the first time after that other report. And that leakage in the ocean, there's a lot of economic cost. It's a great report. I recommend you go to see it. It really is a scene setting. It's got 10 major findings, all of them consistent with other reports we've seen, but it was quite a tour de force. One of the things I want to point out, and then in this report, there was the first time you really saw the picture of connections of the chemicals and pollution to human health and disease. And so this was the first time we saw this picture, and I think it's an important moment. Not that chemical experts haven't known this, but to put a finer point on it, providing that insight into what is happening because of the exposure of people in many ways to the chemicals in plastic. So this brings me to the report that we chaired, and I chaired, and was released at the end of 2021, just at the bitter end of it. So really we started talking about it in 2022. And this answered Congress's question, is the US implicated? The answer is absolutely yes. We are in 20, and we had to, this goes to data, right? The data available that we could obtain told us that we are the world's top generator of plastic waste. We make more waste generally, and a big proportion of that is plastic. We are one of the top 12 contributors of plastic waste leakage into coastal environments. So that's a lot more than I think other people thought. There was a lot of blame. Oh, it's other countries, it's not us. We manage our waste. We do landfill a lot of waste. However, this product and the derived particles from it are leaked around. So we really don't know how much is leaking. I think that's the issue. The US recycling infrastructure can't handle the plastic waste. So, okay, so we basically said there's a big problem, but also Congress asked, would you have any ideas? So, so what we came up with was this is a big problem. Let's break it down into its component parts. It was very clear that in order to address this problem, you can't just do one thing. You have to have a systematic, comprehensive approach to this problem. And you have to start with production because, as we showed, the production is undermining not only the ability of the waste management system to take care of it, but it's also undermining the cost structure for recycled products. So plastic, what do you call primary plastic, is much cheaper to use than a recycled plastic. So the whole system was out of whack. And the other thing, so we said the United States really doesn't have a plan, and you need a plan, and here's how you could break it down. And one of the things we did point out is that in assessing, and there's an appendix to that report, is assessing what we were doing as a nation. Really, most of the attention was at the end of the pipe, trying to clean it up. Really, there was hardly any attention to reducing what was going in, turning off the tap, as it were. So this is an area that we communicated to the White House, and there's certainly and other agencies, and there's clearly an opportunity here for the United States, and I hope to hear more. And they've taken some steps, but this is trying to break a big problem into smaller ones, I think helps. So that was and I credit Jenna Jambek, who was on our committee, for helping us with this diagram, because I think this is a massive problem, and trying to figure out how to take it apart is important. So just as I stopped working on this report, I was asked to join another report. Midru Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health. Our report was, the Congress didn't ask us to look at human health or impacts, really. Excuse me. So the picture you just saw was me and Dr. Adetunde Mustafa of Nigeria. My role on this report was not as a lead. It was to co-write the social and environmental justice section of it, and she's an epidemiologist in Nigeria. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me too. But here, all you need to take from this diagram, which came from this report, and the report authors are from all over the world, and many of them in the health realm, and our lead author is a pediatrician. So what we tried to depict in this is that here are all the ways that human health is implicated in the life cycle of plastic production, use, when you touch it, when kids chew on things, that's exposure too. Not only the pollution that comes from production, but also and the pollution that comes from leaching and disposal, but in the middle of the use cycle. So this was something that we tried to dig into. Well, what does this look like? Hoping I can move this slide. I don't want to go too far. Clicking it again. Sorry, Sarah. Sarah, can you take it back? I think my slide moving is not working. Okay, here we go. So we spent about a year working on this, and our findings were basically consistent with what we heard before. That it's not sustainable to use plastics this way. At that time, we identified 10,500 chemicals in plastics, including known carcinogens and neurotoxicants and endocrine disruptors. And so we have to deal with the chemicals in the plastic too. So not just the material flows, but the formulation. We also tried to estimate the human health costs of plastic, and an economist worked on this. These are staggering numbers. Just from known impacts of certain of the chemicals, not all of them. These estimates were derived either from the burden of disease data, or also from actual US data having to do with disease. The harms disproportionately affect vulnerable communities, and they can be prevented. We know how to deal with pollution. This is the good news. So it's time to do this. Sarah, could you go to the next slide? Sarah, can you move
Your
it?
connection is a little slow, Margaret, so it might take
Yeah,
a second.
sorry. Okay, yeah. So there were recommendations, a global cap on plastic production. This goes to this. Okay, now we've got to get to the source. Single-use items are a big, what some people call, unnecessary, problematic, and avoidable plastic, things you don't need to have it be plastic, really, let's just get rid of them. And extended producer responsibility. This is a term, but basically it's moving the cost of the pollution back to the producer. Next. And that has a very strong impact on improving the situation for social and environmental justice communities. Okay. So again, talking about the chemicals, there need to be health protective standards in the treaty. And that means a lot of scientific input, not only the polymers, but the additives. And also this goes to substitutes. You don't want regrettable substitutes, which is something we've dealt with. And then complexity. So you have to reduce the complexity of plastic in order to actually be able to reuse it efficiently and effectively and economically. So keep plastics in the economy. You've heard the circular economy. So this is the kind of recommendation. Next, Sarah. And so we know we can do this, and it's really a legal, economic, and political issue. And that was a statement from our chair, who is a doctor. So this was a very helpful contribution to the global discussion. And go to the next slide. And about the same time as this came out, not too long after, UNEP itself came out with a chemicals and plastics risk report, very helpful also. They upped the number to 13,000, and the more, every report I've seen since has upped the number of chemicals in plastic. And this goes to transparency. We don't know exactly what is in the plastic we have. Because it's not required to be disclosed. So this is a legal question too, but also a scientific one. Once we know, what can we tell you about what to do about it? And so a big chunk of those were identified as potential chemicals of concern. Next. So this chemical question is in plastics is part of a bigger dialogue. And I'm just going to say there's a whole separate process going forward that was voted on at the same time that the UNEP, that UNEA voted to move forward with the plastic pollution agreement, which is to just set up an expert group on chemicals and waste and pollution. And so that's moving forward at the same time. So there's a lot, this discussion is happening in the context of a lot of other issues. So just wanted to call that to your attention. And that is being set up now. So we don't know exactly when it will be done, but it's moving forward. Next. And it's not tied to the treaty discussion yet. It's known. The other thing is at the end of last year, the Global Framework on Chemicals was created. So this is intended to be somewhat like the biodiversity framework or the climate framework. So we'll see how that goes. But the chemicals discussion is way bigger than this discussion. I just wanted to flag that. Next. And so the science I've sort of whipped through today has influenced this. These are the big topics that are in what we call the zero draft of the Plastic Pollution Treaty, or the draft of the text for the legally binding agreement on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, which is a very long title. But you can see there's room to have discussions about all of these things. We're at a very interesting point in the negotiations, and you'll hear about that later. But you can see that decisions and the definitions and how things are tracked, compliance, monitoring, it's all in here and yet not built. So this is an opportune time to start this discussion. And so I think I'm pretty much at the end of this, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what's on the table. All the science products have set the table for this discussion. Unfortunately, there's not really a place for science there yet. Hopefully there will be a subsidiary body to help advise it, just as we've had for ozone and other substances. So this is where we are today. We're halfway through. Yes, thank you. And yes, Jenna Jambeck's been doing some research on that too. Very interesting on the dollar stores. So next. The other thing to know is that this is an overwhelming question. And so as I showed you the division of a big problem into smaller and still big problems means that negotiators are having a challenging time getting through it. So another thing science can offer is to try and model the impact, model what happens if you choose one lever or the other. And so I don't know, the previous slide is where you showed a lot of the different models that are under discussion. These are tools. They're not perfect. They can't tell you a lot about leakage because we don't have data. And we have estimates. We have modeled estimates of data on leakage. And also but it can show what happens if you pull one lever or the other and what has the biggest impact. And that's been helpful to some of the delegations. I predict that these will keep going. These also are, some of them are used, some of the tools are created to help individual countries figure out how to prioritize what they could do, because every country has its own special issues. They may have more imported waste, they may create a lot, but in all of these scenarios, production has to reduce. You have to reduce production to make anything work, or else you're just going to keep increasing your plastic. So these are just an interesting piece of the tools that science allows, but it's not going to answer every question. And so that's all I have for you, just to set the stage for the very daunting task. And I have links to resources for all these reports, and we'll post those. So thank you so much for giving me the time to talk about this amazing synthesis of information. Now we have to do something about it and make it work. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And so we'll now turn to some of the discussion of the upcoming treaty negotiations and where the treaty negotiations are at. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Alexandra Harrington with us. She's a lecturer in law at Lancaster University Law School. She's also serves as the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law's Task Force on Plastic Pollution. She holds a doctorate in civil law from McGill University Faculty of Law, and has been closely involved with the treaty negotiation process. Alexandra, floor is yours, and thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I skipped ahead, but that's actually fine. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for joining. I'm glad to have this chance to talk about the plastics treaty at any point, especially now since we are essentially halfway through, we expect the negotiating process. So I think it's a very good time for us to start having these discussions, especially in the context of compliance, as we'll see when we get a little further into this presentation. This is really the time when we have to figure out both what we are complying with and then how we are doing it. So we need as much engagement as possible with those of you who are experts in the field. Just to provide a little bit more background, and Margaret did a really fantastic job, especially from the US perspective on how we got here, and the really helpful synthesis between certainly US developments and knowledge generation, and also the international context. In May of 2022, UNEA the UN Environment Assembly, at its meeting, UNEA 5, it was the continued meeting that originally had been held in a hybrid form during COVID, met and decided to provide in Resolution 514 the authorizing text to UNEP and to the Secretariat at UNEP, as well as to member states and observers, etc., to start the negotiation process for an international treaty on plastic pollution. The intent was for this to cover all forms of plastic pollution. So those in the marine environment, as well as those in terrestrial environments, and those that leak from terrestrial into marine environments, as well as the full life cycle range of plastic. So everything from the moment that the polymers are created to the moment that the plastic object is created itself, to its use, and then its either end of life or recycling or reusability in whatever capacity that might be. And this was a very ambitious ask. It still is a very ambitious ask in many ways, because the time frame set for this is quite limited and quite short. And when we think about other treaty regimes, for example, the recently concluded Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, BBNJ treaty, This was negotiated for over 10 years, well over 10 years. And the time request for the plastics treaty, which is the colloquialism we all tend to use for it, is to be finished with the text by the end of this year, so by the end of 2024, and then to have a final intergovernmental meeting in 2025, which would be a high-level meeting where the appropriate country leaders, ministers, etc., would then join to officially and symbolically sign on to the text of the negotiated treaty, and then that would hopefully be brought home and ratified by a number of states. That means that we are at the beginning, still in January for several more hours, at least in the UK, in the very, very beginning of 2023 or 2024, we have only a limited time left to negotiate. So this is a really critical time. In terms of how the negotiations have been conducted thus far, this really is in many ways a new and a daunting process for those who are working in the field, not only because of the time frame, but also because the vast majority of treaties are negotiated within an existing framework. So the Paris Agreement was negotiated within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The BB&J Treaty was negotiated against the larger setting of UN CLOS. This is something quite different. And this is really the negotiation of a new treaty as an independent entity that will presumably, though not definitively, be under the guise of UNEP in terms of secretariat, administration, etc. But it is an entirely new negotiating system. So it is quite different in that regard. We have had thus far 3 negotiating sessions. So the first one took place at the end of 2022 in Punta del Este in Uruguay. And that was very much an opening salvo, if you will, very much a beginning of the conversation. And there were no draft policies, there were no draft texts to come out at that point. It really was an opening dialogue. At INC2, which took place in May 2023 in Paris, there was more momentum. There were also some more procedural issues that came up. And rules of procedure in particular became quite important, and some of those issues are still with us today. And the outcomes of the INC2 process then gave rise to what we call the zero draft, which we'll talk about momentarily, which was an incomplete set, so a portion of text that had been taken from the negotiations and written documents and written submissions of state parties before and during INC2 to give us a sense of what could be in some portions of the treaty, which then was discussed at INC3. After INC3, so at the very end of December, literally, I think it was the 27th or 28th, the UNEP Secretariat released the revised zero draft. Often this would be known in other treaty processes as the first draft because it is the first full draft. And that will be used as the basis for our negotiations at INC4 in Ottawa in April, which is only now a few short months away. And then as the schedule currently sits, INC5, so what is intended to be the last negotiating session, would take place in Busan in the Republic of South Korea in November of 2024 into December. There is always the possibility that should it be necessary, additional INCs could be authorized, etc. And we'll certainly see UNEA 6 is meeting at the end of February. So we will see if there are any clarifications on the Resolution 514 text and timeline given at the end of February. But as it stands, this is our current calendar for the treaty negotiations. When we looked at the initial zero draft, which was released in September and should be 23, not 24, my mind was very much playing with dates when I was looking at things last night. In advance of INC3, the intent was this document to come out to facilitate dialogue in advance and then to help inform the contact groups during the negotiations. Now, as a bit of background, because again, the negotiating process can be an unfamiliar entity to many people, including many who are involved in international law for a number of years. When we have a negotiating session, we have all the main plenary sessions, which are the sessions where all member states come together, as well as observers and stakeholders. And as Margaret quite rightly mentioned and observed, the issues are increasingly involving those who are seeking environmental justice as well as social justice, Indigenous communities, youth members, etc. So all groups have the opportunity to come together in plenary. And that is where the initial discussions are held, the welcoming, the opening statements are given. Typically, there are report backs periodically throughout the negotiating week. We are usually on a 5 to 7 day negotiating week. And then at the end to adopt measures to move forward. In the meantime, what typically happens is that a contact group or a series of contact groups will be created, and that allows for much more nuanced negotiation on particular topics. So there will be a mandate given to each contact group that it will address, for example, certain provisions of the zero draft or for INC4 of the revised zero draft. And then the expectation and the hope is that these groups will come back to the meeting of the whole, the plenary, to report on progress made and fully to provide some type of draft text, negotiated text moving forward that can be put to the larger group for discussion and one would like to think potentially agreement on inclusion in the treaty itself. Now, INC3 was a little bit difficult in the sense that we had a portion, we had a zero draft, it was not a full draft. And so the things that were not included for opening discussion in the contact groups themselves were things like the initial provisions, other than the objectives, which were included, and also the potential for compliance mechanisms, what they would look like, what they would entail, how they would be constituted, what jurisdiction they would have, etc. We also didn't necessarily have a clear understanding, because the zero draft was silent, on the idea of reporting. There was some idea of a national action plan or national plan for reporting, but many aspects were also silent at that point. And during INC3, there were a number of concerns raised by some states regarding how the zero draft text itself reflected submissions from INC2, from before INC2 and after INC2, from state parties. And some concerns were raised over the fact that not every state's submissions were included or statements were included. And this was done very much in the hope of finding, I think, unifying language and to avoid repetition. But it is important to note, because the outcomes of INC3 included a deep concern on the part of the Secretariat and of the Bureau members who are helping to negotiate to derive the negotiated texts, that this not happen again moving forward, and that the faith that may have been lost by some parties be in a way restored. So INC3 ended with no consensus on potential element text. So there was no agreement on an objective. There was no agreement on any aspect of what text may go into even portions of the zero draft. Additionally, there had been a hope that there would be intersessional working groups established for things like deciding what needed a specific legal definition to be included in the text of the treaty or in an annex, to decide what potentially compliance measures might look like, what models might be best to use for compliance measure design, to address questions such as just transitions and a number of social equity issues. And all of these had been proposed at various points throughout INC3. However, that due to some procedural issues, a group of states, small group of states, was able to stop that from happening. So this means that there is a great deal of work for those of us who are involved in the treaty process in the intersessional period that needs to be done, and it largely is being done in forums such as this, where we have a number of states coming together, NGOs, IGOs, other organizations coming together to try to act and fill that void and generate some consensus moving into INC4. The timeline was also quite important in that there were no benchmarks given or no allowances adopted for either states or stakeholders to make formal submissions to express their views on the revised zero draft in advance of INC 4. And this was very uncommon since in advance of INC 1 and 2 and 3, there were opportunities to make statements for both states and stakeholders to make statements as to their opinions on initially what the most critical elements for review and discussion would be. And then as we started to have deeper negotiations on where the treaty should go. So again, consensus building in the interim period is much more difficult, and it really does rely a lot more on outreach efforts by states and stakeholders on their own, rather than authorizing the Secretariat to do this on the behalf of the international community. Again, this should have been in late December 2023. I apologize. When we did get the revised zero draft, it reflected and still continues to reflect the criticisms of the zero draft, in that we now have every suggestion that was made during the Nairobi week of negotiations at INC 3 reflected in the text. And as such, the full document is now 70 pages. I am happy to put a link in the chat or to share with anyone who's interested the links to both the zero draft and the revised zero draft, as well as various documents that my task force has written and provided to general public to help with the negotiating process. But the full document itself is 70 pages, and that's always an interesting amount to read and negotiate. What is in the 70 pages is actually quite interesting. So it's 70 pages that address the vast majority of potential elements of the entire treaty. There are some things that still remain unaddressed. So there is no text, for example, for things like entry to force, reservation options, etc. So very technical details. For many of the articles that do exist or have been proposed, there are multiple options reflecting multiple viewpoints of different countries. And in some instances, we have up to 17 options for one provision. This obviously can be quite problematic from a negotiation standpoint because you are trying to whittle down a great number of options in a relatively short period of time. There is also a concern that can be raised because the vast majority of the control measures specifically, so the regulatory aspects of the treaty draft, have a no text option. And the no text option means that they would not be included. And if one looks carefully at the text of the revised zero draft, theoretically, it would be possible to have a text that has very little actual regulatory provision in it. So this is another concern. There are also a number of bracketed text options. So there are some concerns about a fundamental lack of agreement. And as as Margaret mentioned, and as Susan has kind of seen over the past number of days in all of our discussions about this, the way that we think of the treaty itself as a framework or as a specific treaty is very much still up in the air. The structure itself is very much still up in the air, and thus we find ourselves halfway through with a revised zero draft that we will certainly use as our negotiating basis, but still leaves a great deal of room for discussion and debate, and will require a great deal more clarity as to what we actually mean when we mean plastic and plastic pollution. How do we define plastic? Are we talking about polymers? Are we talking about chemicals of concern? How are we getting to those really fundamental issues of the treaty? So these will be things that need to be addressed, certainly in Ottawa in April, and then hopefully will be addressed there, and if not, certainly beyond that. In terms of compliance, there are certainly many proposals for national plans or national action plans, as well as national reporting requirements. Most of those would connect to a compliance committee or similar mechanism in some way. Although again, the proposals for what these committees might look like vary quite dramatically. There are specific concerns and there are specific areas where I think it would be very helpful to have perspectives from all of you from the compliance community in terms of jurisdiction and powers for these committees. And so the idea of a compliance committee or an oversight committee at the moment ranges from an entity that would be non-punitive to an entity that would have some punitive powers. It also could be something that has jurisdiction only over matters referred by states themselves regarding their own conduct. There are also proposals that would have it be much more similar to a Paris Agreement type structure where you have the ability of a state to refer another state, where the Secretariat could refer, and where others could refer as well. So this is very much an open question. The question of reporting and compliance has also come in two ways. First of all, in terms of some states requesting that reporting only be done in a way that looks at the developed states requirement. And so the developed states would be required to do so, but no one else would. It would be voluntary. And there also are some aspects that would look at how SIDS, the small island states and least developed countries, report, how they are required to report, how they are required to comply and be considered as actors in the compliance system. So it is a very, this is our next slide, so I will just go back to that for 1 second. It is a very much complex and evolving situation with the treaty negotiations at the moment. We anticipate that they will obviously be very much living entities in the next 2 iterations, and that we will see a great deal more of efforts to address compliance, to address issues that will need to be implemented at the national levels, and to determine how things like reporting will feed into national compliance requirements and also national legal and regulatory system requirements as we move forward. So I will stop here and I am happy to answer any questions once we get to that point, or if there are questions in the Q&A, please do post them. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alexandra. We'll move on to our next perspective, which will look at the plastics issue in the context of Asia, where plastics issues have been very prominent. Our presenter is Chocho Devapapura Hartakula, and I hope I came close on that. She is the program manager for the Asian Environmental Compliance and Enforcement Network, where she works with 18 countries in Asia. She also manages the regional project portfolio addressing plastics and marine pollution at the IGES Bangkok Regional Center. Chocho, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be one of the speakers today. So as Dr. Alexandra touched on a lot about the INC related process, so I'm not going to go through that today. Next. So my presentation will start from the plastic pollution in the Asia Pacific. So as we know that Asia Pacific actually represent a significant plastic contributor in the world, and the life cycle approach to addressing plastic pollution involve taking the issue of production to disposal is really important. Next. So IGES has actually been involved in the INC process, starting from our participation in the INC webinar for the INC 3, where I actually presented about the National Action Plan development and update in ASEAN member state. So at this webinar, we actually presented about the outcome of the regional training workshop that we organized in Bangkok. And that was actually on the National Action Plan on Marine Debris and Evidence-Based Policy Making and Solid Waste Management in ASEAN, where we discuss a lot of challenges and countermeasure. So I actually presented there. So the purpose of the webinar was actually to support the negotiator consideration of this issue in the development of the future instrument on plastic pollution through a presentation of relevant existing framework and experience. Next. And we were also selected as one of the co-organizers for the thematic side event at INFRE on monitoring the situation, progress of the future instrument with the focus of the objective, target, baseline, indicator, and timelines. So my presentation there was actually specifically focused on the ASEAN region's progress and challenges in tackling plastic waste and marine debris. So we emphasize the need for setting realistic and achievable targets, and also highlighted the crucial need for transparent, consistent, and harmonized data collection. We also advocate for standardized approach to data that also take into account the specific context of local region. So the session was actually led by Catherine Sigwart from IUCN, and the session also include their panel like Dr. Musandar Momba from the Ramsar Convention on Westland, and Cristobal from the Chilean Ministry of the Environment, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and also the CDP and myself. Next, please. So during the INC process, apart from organizing a side event, I also intended to make the intervention, although it was never really got a chance to due to time constraint during the contact group and also the plenary session. So basically, if we look at the zero draft itself, we can see that the first draft actually referenced to the necessary and appropriate measure, and also lacking the specific definition. So we actually propose more clear definition by adding something like necessary and appropriate measure in the treaty to include regulations, economic instrument, information disclosure, reporting, monitoring, and compliance and enforcement tool. This would actually ensure consistent understanding throughout the treaty, and additionally also incorporating this language into section where it is currently absent, and also could further enhance clarity. Beyond this, we also suggest considering developing a set of compliance and enforcement principles to support national implementation of this comprehensive treaty. And also this principle could be discussed in a side event or through a submission at the next session which we are also planning right now. They could also include the guideline for drafting simple, effective law and regulation, anticipating non-compliant and ensuring robust monitoring, and also specifying reporting requirement and encouraging public disclosure for oversight. Moreover, this principle should also include incentives for self-auditing, early compliant training, and ensure strong sanctioning in the treaty implementation law to deter future violation. for this one, I found it's very difficult after having a chance to talk with a member with the member states, and also restorative justice mechanism and consideration for product life cycle and design to prevent non-compliant. The registration might also explore the citizen enforcement and also set clear timeline for voluntary compliance with contingency for regulatory action if needed. So many thanks to Lee who actually support in draft this. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to present about the plastic pollution situation in Asia. So as we know that, the solving plastic pollution is really important, and the Asia Pacific region are among the world largest source of plastic pollution. So for example, Japan is one of the world's biggest plastic waste producer because of it reliant on single-use plastic, from plastic bottle production to plastic packaging. Japan also aimed to promote policy tackling marine plastic, including the most recent act on promotion of resource circulation for plastic, which was passed in 2021 that aimed for a transition to a circular economy. Japan also released Osaka Blue Ocean Vision in June 2019, aiming to reduce marine plastic litter to zero by 2050 through a life cycle approach, and has published a national action plan and also a number of publications, including the G20 related to marine litter report as well. For Thailand actually has a similar faced with a single-use plastic problem, despite having a high rate of waste collection and recycling. A large amount of mismanaged plastic waste actually found in the marine environment, and microplastic especially have permeated the upper and lower Shi River, which threatened to make marine ecosystem inhabited. And also in 2009, Thailand released the roadmap for plastic waste management 2018 to 2030, and also has published the action plan phase 1 and phase 2, starting from 2020 up until 2027. For Vietnam, in coastal and river-side plastic account for the majority of waste found in Vietnam. A report actually released by the World Bank found that over 60% of plastic items in Vietnam are single-use plastic. And in 2018, 42% of plastic were mismanaged, or which were burned, leaked, or remained at litter. So under a business as usual scenario, plastic leakage would more than double by 2030. Vietnam also has created a national action plan that aims to transition to a circular economy through the policy, economic instrument, technical tools, education, and plastic life cycle policy. Next, for the Cambodia actually has a lack of waste management infrastructure, which has prevented effective recycling of plastic waste. In 2022, plastic actually made up 24% of all waste, and increased from just 5% in 1997. There have been several community efforts and by organizations to help clean up waste, raise awareness of plastic waste, and increase recycling effort. For example, the UNDP has collaborated with other organizations and schools in supporting to treat plastic waste and provide water filtration system. Cambodia also has a municipal solid waste management plan 2020 to 2030, which address plastic waste. But currently, the National Action Plan which IGES and its partners support in developing is actually under the final stage of development. So next presentation. This presentation actually show the result of the questionnaire by the Water Environment Partnership in Asia, which IGES is actually a secretariat. The questionnaire was taken from in November 2022 that was sent to the member countries. And this actually show that the type of industry that, create a water pollution, and that was identified like as a sort in each country. So if you look in the red highlight, you will see that most of this industry actually involve plastic industry. For example, the food, beverage, and tobacco industry frequently use plastic packaging, which can end up in water body, among others industries. Next, please. In ASEAN, as I mentioned earlier, so now we have a lot of progress in the region. So because of course we were identified as one of the largest contributor. So out of the 10 countries in ASEAN, 6 countries have already completed their national action plan related to plastic pollution. And then 4 countries, including Brunei, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, in the final, in their developing or in the final stage of development of the national action plan. Other than that, they have already implemented their national action plan. And it's also worth to mention that ASEAN region also have the regional action plan, which was led by the Thai government with the support from the World Bank as well. Next, please. For IGES, we also support in developing the national action plan for Cambodia and Myanmar through the strengthening capacity for marine debris reduction in ASEAN region, through the formulation of national action plan for Asian member state and integrated land to sea policy approach of phase 2. So the presentation here the next presentation will actually involve with the regional training workshop that we organized back in September last year, where we actually identify a lot of challenges and also countermeasure in the ASEAN region. Next, please. So as you can see here, there are ambitious NAP targets, data harmonization and monitoring, capacity building and knowledge sharing, coordination mechanism, local implementation, legal consequences, fine for non-compliant, were listed as challenges that found in ASEAN region. Of course, in terms of the countermeasure, we got a number of options there. So we need to set the realistic and feasible goal along with appropriate indicator, standardized framework need to be there, and open communication, and also promote regional collaboration and coordination, and also mobilization of the technical and financial support. Last but not least, strengthening enforcement mechanism. Next, please. In terms of the compliance and enforcement issue of the draft treaty, most countries actually agree on implementing a life cycle approach to managing plastic waste based on the INC-free event. But however, countries still disagree on the extent to which plastic should be banned. Some country, which I'm not going to name here, actually believe that addressing plastic pollution is important, but should not include a ban on production limits. Additionally, most Asian nations already have national action plan to manage plastic waste, but some countries are still in the final process or in the process of developing. There also needs to be greater funding of waste management infrastructure in certain countries such as Cambodia to ensure that effective recycling and reduce leakage to marine environment and can be made a reality. Greater exchange of technical and financial assistance will also be necessary to transition from low-income Asian country to a circular economy as well. Next, please. In terms of how the government should enforce in Asia, of course, monitor plastic and take inventory of plastic leakage is really important. Monitoring the life cycle of plastic will allow us to have better understanding of how much plastic each country is using and how it can keep itself accountable to transitioning to zero waste. Data harmonization, which was previously mentioned, was also important in terms of creating standardized practice for more comparable data among countries. For example, Japan has a report called Guidelines for Harmonizing Ocean Surface Microplastic Monitoring Method. So countries should also coordinate guidelines to minimize the barrier to monitoring. Community engagement and education is also really crucial to help individuals to understand plastic pollution and what are the best practices to properly dispose of plastic waste. Economic incentive also will help to curb the demand and make sure that we have the balance, the economic need for each country that most marginalized member while promoting the transition to a circular economy as well. Life cycle approach is actually quite crucial in terms of curbing plastic pollution because it's considered the impact of all state of plastic product life cycle. So it's really important that the national action plan should actually include both downstream and upstream policy to effectively tackle plastic waste. EPR mandate that producer take responsibility for the cost and management of disposal. Other practices include recycled content standard, eco-design, criteria of plastic packaging, and to reduce micro leakage is also really important among other things. Next, please. In terms of data focus, capacity building, and knowledge sharing, I'd like to share that in ASEAN region, we actually have the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia that play a very vital role in establishing foundation for data on plastic in the region in collaboration with the OECD and also IGES, and are now working on the regional plastic outlook in ASEAN Plus 3. We also have the G20 report on action against marine plastic litter, which led by the Ministry of the Environment Japan and G20 presidency with the support from IGES, and so also other knowledge product as well. And this actually, the IGES has actually been at the forefront of the managing and supporting the substantial portfolio of many projects, which are listed here. Sorry, I have to wrap up. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chocho, and very important information about what's happening in South Asia. Our last speaker is Joe Pooks. Joe is the Deputy Chief of the Environmental Crime Section at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he supervises 36 environmental prosecutors. Since 2015, Joe has served as chair of Interpol's Pollution Crime Working Group. So rather than looking forward and to enforcement under the Plastics Treaty, we're going to look at what are some of the law enforcement problems related to plastics that are occurring right now. Joe.
Thank you, Lee. Can you hear me, Lee?
Yes, we
Excellent. Just want to make sure I'm coming through, and I'm going to turn my video off in a second because I'm a vain man and I can't read the screen without my glasses, but we'll come back on, I promise. And want to talk a little bit about enforcement. As you said, there's a lot of talk about plastics these days, the threats they pose, the ways to reduce those threats through regulations, laws, or treaties. But one subject that I don't think gets talked about as much is enforcement. That's the enforcement of the regulations and the laws and the treaties. Well, I would agree that enforcement is not the solution to the plastics problem. That's going to be more on the production side. I think that enforcement needs to be a priority of any meaningful regulatory scheme, or else that scheme is just going to be, wishful thinking. I think we're already on the enforcement side seeing some of the effects of the lack of talk about enforcement, as we're seeing criminals and other organized groups attracted by the enormous amounts of money to be made and the low likelihood of getting caught, getting involved in the plastics trade. And some of the results of their involvement is a disruption of the legitimate plastics disposal market, corrupting legitimate businesses, and actually preventing the establishment of a legitimate domestic recycling program in many countries. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure. Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. Part of the problem that we see, just to describe the challenges that we're facing, is there's a constant competition between plastics production and plastics disposal. The demand for plastic products, which increased in particular during the pandemic, and the availability of cheap or even free feedstock to make plastics, has resulted in a huge increase in the amount of plastic being produced every year. I think I've seen somewhere where it's upwards of 400 million tons of plastic being produced every year, and somewhere upwards of 350 million tons of plastic waste being generated every year. Now, I've seen the numbers move a little bit, depending on who you talk with, but not by any degrees of magnitude. And if we're going to, I think, quibble about the numbers, I think we're having the wrong conversation. This generation of plastic waste has created a global market for plastic disposal. And I've seen some numbers estimating the amount as high as in excess of $50 billion in terms of money to be made in the plastics recycling market. As you might imagine, that creates a large incentive for groups to try and get a piece of the action and get involved in the plastics disposal business. As folks on the phone or in the call know, prior to 2018, most of our plastic producing countries sent their waste to China. Countries that sent their waste over because Chinese recycling companies paid to take our waste. And as a result of being able to export our problem, most consumer countries never really developed a meaningful recycling program within their own countries. Unfortunately, the bad news was in 2018, China closed its doors and said they were no longer going to be accepting our waste. Unfortunately, as we talked about before, the waste keeps piling up and needs to go somewhere. Companies keep producing plastic, and that plastic leads to waste. And that waste can't be ignored. It has to be either landfilled or shipped overseas. What we saw was sort of a downstream impact with countries trying to take over China's markets. Unfortunately, the countries that were taking a lot of the plastics that went to China before did not have the infrastructure to responsibly handle the plastic waste they were taking. In addition, generally, what facilities they did have could only handle clean plastic waste, which I think folks will tell you is not the majority of the plastic waste that is generated. I'd say also, in addition, the regulatory system, such as it is, relies on competent authorities in each country to monitor and enforce international treaties like Basel and other requirements concerning the disposal of plastics. Unfortunately, these competent authorities are usually the national environmental agencies that are not able to efficiently handle the inspections that they have. They're usually they're the least resourced agency in the country, and so are very strapped to provide a meaningful oversight of the plastic recycling industry, and definitely do not have the capacity to do horizon scanning. They're focused more on the day-to-day. So the regulatory framework designed to monitor the plastics market is not very effective, and it leads to a lot of opportunities for people to exploit the system. The opportunity presented to a lot of the criminal organized groups is not unique to plastics or waste. It's traditionally whatever model they look at, be it drugs, guns, human trafficking. There's a high demand, namely that there's a lot of plastic waste that needs to be moved. There are limited options of how you can responsibly do it. The cost to ship it overseas in shipping containers is very low. The profit that you can make off of doing the shipping plastics overseas illegally is incredibly high. The weak regulatory framework gives them a lot of means to exploit the system. There are very low chances of detection, and if you get caught, the consequences are going to be minimal. And so, in short, what they are being presented with is almost a license to print money, which creates a tremendous opportunity for these criminal groups. Some of the threats posed by this situation is we're seeing the constant rerouting of illegal waste to more vulnerable countries. As other countries shut their doors, there are other countries that are saying, sure, we will take your waste because of the amount of money to be involved. And again, these countries do not have the capacity to handle the plastic waste that is being sent to them. As a result, once the plastic arrives in their countries, it's being illegally disposed of, either in landfills in their countries or put right back into the ocean in the port from which it arrives. Another challenge that we've seen or threat posed is the increased incidence of corruption and a lack of respect for the rule of law. Customs authorities that are seeing these imports come into their countries are sometimes being paid to look the other way, to allow these shipments to come in, which again generates a lot of problems downstream in terms of trying to have any meaningful enforcement or compliance regime. We are also seeing an infiltration of legitimate businesses by organized crime groups looking to get in on a piece of the action. Again, there's the amount of money to be made here. These crime groups are very eager to take a piece of the market. And again, because the consequences of getting caught in this area are so low, it's a risk they're very willing to take. We've actually seen organized crime groups turn away from traditional law enforcement issues such as drugs and guns and go into the waste and plastic waste market because it's much less risky for them. And then lastly, as a practical matter, the illegal plastics trade is taking away any chance of setting up any meaningful domestic recycling program within individual countries. As long as the cost of making fresh plastics or virgin plastics is lower than the cost of recycled plastics, there's going to be no incentive for countries or companies to invest a lot of resources in recycling programs. Some of the actors that we've seen get involved in the market are brokers, for example. Those are both brokers and middlemen who arrange to take plastics or plastic waste from one country to another. We're seeing a lot of these brokers are, let's say, less visible in terms of being able to trace where the ownership is, where the operators are. They're paper companies in a lot of instances. And when waste is being tracked or being intercepted, it becomes very challenging to find who the actual people are responsible for the illegal shipments. Transporters, obviously, the shipping industry is one of the biggest transporters here. Given the volume of waste, shipping containers is the only practical area or practical method to export this waste. In my experience, the shipping industry has been notoriously opaque in terms of trying to trace who is sending what where, and that lends itself very much to the illegal plastics trade. Thirdly, customs officers. As I mentioned before, they're the ones that sometimes when the waste comes into a country, looks the other way, doesn't really examine the paper documents that are being submitted in terms of stating what the contents of the shipments are. And so they are another weak point in the system. And then lastly, recyclers. What we've seen in a lot of countries is the recyclers are able to charge a premium to tell people that they're handling the waste responsibly, and then they are exporting them at a greatly reduced discount, again, making large amounts of money. And all four of these areas have been very difficult to track under the current regulations. What we've also seen is sort of a convergence of organized crime and legitimate businesses. There are some legitimate businesses that get involved in the illegal plastics trade, and what you can see is that they're involved in the concealing of waste in their shipments, misdeclarations of what's being shipped, fraud, money laundering, but we're also seeing the organized crime groups get in on the illegitimate side. We've actually seen them set up fronts as legitimate businesses to handle waste from country A, and then sending it to another quasi-legitimate business in country B. And again, creating the appearance of a legitimate industry when it's actually being fronted by organized crime. We've also seen a convergence of the plastics and waste trade, believe it or not, with other traditional criminal operations. Sometimes with the plastics that are being shipped, or they hide drug shipments within the waste. We've seen human trafficking in the sense of some of the recycling facilities in other countries are using human trafficked workers to process and recycle their waste. So there's a big convergence between legitimate and illegitimate criminal groups. I get this a lot. What's the evidence? Is this really a big problem? Just have some stories here where we're seeing around the world this issue of organized crime getting involved in the waste industry. For example, in Poland, there was a sort of a proliferation of nighttime fires of recycling or waste storage facilities that was being set up by organized crime, because setting fire to something is a lot cheaper than having to dispose of things correctly. They've had to create a special waste unit in Poland to handle this matter. Italy, similar. There's a mafia has been involved in the plastic recycling business in Italy. Now that's organized crime in Italy has been involved in the waste industry for many years. This is just another iteration of that. And then we've seen other recycling scams across the world. And this photo was published in France about organized crime groups getting in the profit from plastic waste surge. So I just throw those in there to show this isn't just me talking. This is something or a trend that we've seen around the world. Some of the recommendations or suggestions would have in this area is we need better law enforcement cooperation at the national and international level. A lot of these issues involve transboundary shipments of waste, and we all know how challenging it can be to coordinate or work together even within one's own country. Doing that when you're dealing with multiple countries and multiple borders, it becomes even more of a challenge. And these are areas that the organized crime groups are much more familiar with. They have traditional methods of transporting illegal substances. And so they are one step ahead. And so if we're going to get a handle on this, it's going to be something that we're going to have to, make it a concerted effort to work better together at both the national and international level. We need to generate more intelligence and information on these waste routes that are being done. Sometimes, unfortunately, when the question comes up, people ask for the evidence, and they take a lack of evidence as being a lack of evidence that there's a problem, when it's actually more a lack of effort to gather the intelligence and information to give us the information on being able to attack this problem. Again, a lot of these issues that have come up, we hear anecdotally, we hear in some of the groups, for example, the Interpol group I work with. But I think countries have to make more of an effort to proactively seek out the information that will allow them to be more effective. Thirdly, working with legitimate private sector groups. This is an issue that I think one of the few issues that we need to actually have a conversation with industry being in the room. As we've said, this is not a problem that enforcement is going to be the leader in, but it certainly has a role to play. We see companies setting up billion-dollar facilities now in many different countries to produce more plastics. We see the petrochemical companies moving from petrol or gasoline for cars into the plastics industry because, as we said before, there's a lot of free or very cheap feedstock being generated from fracking and other activities. And it's going to be on the production side that it's going to be our best chance to have any meaningful impact on the production. We also need to be working more with non-governmental actors, NGOs, civil societies, who have access to a lot of information and a lot of data that will make us more effective when it comes to compliance and enforcement. There's a natural reluctance, I think, with law enforcement to engage with non-law enforcement folks. And I think particularly in this area, when you're dealing with borders and international crime, that's a prejudice we need to get rid of, because these NGOs or civil societies have a lot of information that would be useful for us. I think we also need to improve our waste tracking capability, and by that I mean more electronic tracking. We are in many ways dealing with a 19th century technique to solve a 21st century problem. A lot of the documents and materials we're seeing, the records are being kept in paper form, and that does not provide the relative competent authorities an ability to track waste in real time. And by the time they have an idea that something has come in that shouldn't have, that waste is gone, and you're not going to be able to track that down. Lastly, as I said before, enforcement isn't the solution in this situation. Prevention on the production side is, but I think we need to acknowledge enforcement as a priority in any meaningful regulatory scheme. We've talked, the criminals are not willing to wait to 2025 or 2026 to begin their illegal activities. We've asked them, and they've been very unreasonable. They want to start now, given the amount of money to be made. And so I don't think we can afford to wait. If we wait much longer, many of these markets are going to be infiltrated. And once these groups are in the market, they're going to be very hard to dislodge. And again, as I said before, it's going to be very hard to set up any meaningful recycling program in any country as long as the economics argue against it. Lastly, just two reports I would suggest to people. One was a strategic analysis report on trends in the plastic waste market by Interpol, who we work with very closely. And then secondly, there's a plastic for profit report by the Global Initiative. My friends Virginia Camoli and Willie Wilson put that together. Has a lot of good information. But again, I probably most people on this presentation, or I'm preaching to the choir, the issue of there being a problem we need to address, I don't think anybody doubts. I just think at some point we need to be thinking of enforcement on the front end as we go along before it's too late to solve the problem. So that's me, and I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you, Joe. And I realize that we're close to the end of our time. I have a quick question for Alexandra, and that is the distinction that you would make between elements related to compliance that could be part of the treaty structure itself versus provisions in the treaty that could facilitate national implementation, such as providing for capacity building post-treaty. So I would welcome your brief comments on that distinction.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all so much. I feel like I want to talk to everyone for hours, especially Joe. I feel like there's lots we need to chat about. But I think this is a really critical point, and it's one of the points where we've seen a number of states really come in quite hard and be quite adamant that there is the need for capacity building and technology transfer, not only money. There certainly is an important part to be played by money and by financing, and there are several models and methods for a potential fund. And that, again, it might be another conversation for another time. But here, the capacity building and the technology transfer elements are really on helping to address all phases of the life cycle, and helping particularly the small island states and the LDCs figure out how to handle the question of what do we do with plastic that is already in existence, so legacy plastic, as well as new plastics, and how do we adjust our recycling systems, or how do we build our recycling systems, how do we handle substitutes, et cetera, in our recycling network. So it really is a very multifaceted concept of capacity building and technology transfer. And there's one point I think to stress in technology transfer that is different for those of us who've been used to that term over time in international law, And that is that the idea is technology transfer on agreed upon terms. So technology transfer that is agreed on by both the state or entity transferring the technology as well as receiving the technology, so that it will close some of the gaps in terms of a developed state, for example, being able to say, oh, but we transferred a certain type of knowledge or technology to a developing state without it actually being something that's appropriate at all. So I think we see that being really critical.
Thank you very much. Well, we've filled our hour and a half with a lot of information. I know that we haven't been able to get to a number of the questions. Hopefully those can be recorded, and then we'll provide them to the panelists, and hopefully we can get some responses back in some form, perhaps online with the ELI INES website. So Susanna, I'm going to turn it back to you to close our webinar, and thanks to all of our great panelists for the presentation today.
Thanks, Lee, for moderating, and thank you to Margaret, Alexandra, Chocho, and Joe for such an engaging discussion. Thank you all for the questions you sent in, and as was mentioned, the recording of the event plus any slides or other resources that were mentioned will be available in a few days on the website. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.